Hello, and welcome to an all new episode of the Transfix Take podcast, where each week we deliver news, insights, and trends for shippers and carriers. It's the week of April 3rd. I'm Jenny Ruiz, and I'm joined by our market expert, Justin Mays. Mays, we're already in April. Can you believe it?
I
How's it
can't believe
going?
it. Already in Q2.
I know. It
Time's
feels
flying.
like, yeah, I don't know what happened to Q1. It feels like it was just the fastest Q1 we've had yet.
Yeah, not a whole lot of noise to the freight market either, outside of,
I know.
winter weather.
Yeah, we'll see what happens at the end of this quarter as we are predicting some interesting things. But that said, we are deep in the April showers bring May flowers moment with what Weather Optics CEO Scott Pecorello is calling a large and complex winter storm on the horizon from the Midwest to the Northeast this week. Blizzard conditions are even possible. So let's talk about the top five worst weather lanes powered by Weather Optics. Now we've got at the very top, Minneapolis to Chicago is the worst for potential shipment delays at a projected 65% and a driver risk score of 10 out of 10. We've also got Buffalo to Boston, Boston to Philly, Los Angeles to Phoenix. And Scott recommends going south along US 6 and I-70 instead of I-80 if possible, as that'll have the significantly lower risk, and then Kansas to Chicago. Now, Mays, what are we seeing in terms of movement and delays this week given the stormy weather?
Nothing just yet, but as you called out, like the winter weather still existing, even though it's 80 degrees here in Atlanta, could potentially have some impacts. But I think most of the impacts will live in lower volume markets, lower volume traveled lanes, as
Okay.
you pointed out. But it's definitely something to keep an eye on. I mean, the Midwest and Northeast, we'll get into it, but are the loosest regions. So this will give some carriers an opportunity to kind of push up rates. But it probably the last time this year that they have that opportunity caused by weather.
Oh my. Well, let's hope that's the case. That said, you know what? It's time for the regional breakdown. Now, it looks like another flat week, but we've got a lot of movement happening as we drive into May. So, Mays, what's the breakdown of where the national average rate per mile looks like? And have tender rejections moved at all?
So you're 100% right. It's been a pretty quiet, flat week as we drove out of the month of March and Q1.
Yeah.
We saw some pressure at the very last days of the month, mainly driven in the tender rejection sector, but it's still nothing really noticeable. Everything is relatively flat, but really being driven by regional lanes, I'd say,
Okay.
which we'll get into. But overall, not a lot of noise as we leave March and Q1, going into April, which is generally speaking a pretty soft month in the industry.
Yeah.
So it'll be exciting to see what plays out.
The calm before the storm. Why don't we get started with the region that had the largest overall movement, the South? Carriers moving in and out of specifically Texas markets showed the tightest markets, especially San Antonio and Laredo. So, what are we seeing here?
Yeah, we're still seeing some troubles in the South region due to capacity. A lot of it is going to be along the border and in the high volume markets like Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth. Last week we talked that we were actually seeing some softening in Texas, but that quickly reverted back to some tightening,
Yeah.
which is anticipated for this time of the year, but it's probably still more than most would have anticipated. It's really the region driving the increase in rates throughout the country. This is probably still due to imports being shipped into the U.S. via Mexico.
Yep.
But it's somewhere to watch because, we are getting ever so closer to produce season, which we'll talk about in other regions.
Over to the east of this region is the southeast. Now, it's still experiencing some tightness with just about every length of haul, with the exception of local freight, seeing average rate increases of 0.27%, which is barely noticeable. But, we've mentioned that this is a big region to watch. So, what can we expect over the next week here?
Yeah, so the Southeast is going to continue to tighten. It's going to be driven by Florida and even some of the large markets like Atlanta. Atlanta is a volume driver in the Southeast. We're seeing some tightening there. Overall, the Southeast is going to continue. It's going to be a week after week story that we talk about the Southeast getting tighter as we move into produce season. I mean, we are anticipating the largest increase to take place in the Southeast through the month of April. So we are seeing it in real time live out. But the increase, generally speaking, starts to gain momentum the second half of April. So I think next week we'll be talking about the same increase on average
Yeah.
before it really taken a step forward.
Okay, now driving on up, we hit the coastal region, which experienced some tightening in most regions, with the exception of Winchester and Baltimore. And this region is seeing a 0.53% uptick in the average rate. So the question is, will the tightening continue here?
So I think this region's really being driven by a split. The freight going down to the southeast is seeing downward momentum.
Yeah.
Most of the freight leaving and originating in the coastal region
Yeah.
are either going up to the northeast or shorter hauls to the Midwest or down to the southeast. What's happening is we're seeing a large increase on freight picking up in the coastal region, going up to the northeast and Midwest because they're so undesirable. That's going to continue, but I don't think it's going to be so much momentum going forward. I think we're going to start seeing that die down because the rates going down to the southeast and south are going to start dragging the average rate out of the coastal region. So it's really going to be, are you going north? Because if you're going north, you're going to see more tightening. But if you're going south, you're going to start seeing that loosening with lower rates.
Oh, that's an interesting split. But you've always mentioned that the north and south were always going to be dependent on where the coastal region sits. So not surprising, but we'll definitely keep an eye on that one. Why don't we head up I-95 to the northeast, which, as you mentioned last week, would continue its loosening. But given the weather factors, maybe that's going to change. Only 3 markets saw some marginal gains, like Brooklyn, Buffalo, and Rochester. And we never mentioned Brooklyn on the show, so that's an interesting fact there. My guess is we won't see much of an impact, but I could be wrong here, so what's the story?
Yeah, we're not going to really see much of an impact when it comes over the average. The average rate may change, right? But it's not going to be really impactful to the market because your main volume driving markets like Harrisburg, Allentown, Philly, Elizabeth, New Jersey aren't going to see much of an impact from this winter weather. Some of the markets that you called out, like Rochester and Buffalo, may continue to experience some, positive momentum on the rates because of the storm. Yeah. But overall, the Northeast is going to continue its downward trend, especially for freight going down to the Southeast. That is where we're seeing momentum pick up pretty rapidly already, along with freight going down to the South. Now, when it's going to the coastal region, Midwest, West Coast, it's kind of mixed feelings, but I think throughout the month we're going to continue to see this region loosen up as anticipated.
Okay, now continuing with the Midwest, this saw the most change with short hauls and mid hauls over 1% each, but this region is showing more loosening than tightening. So what are some market callouts here?
Yeah, it's really a factor of high volume markets versus low volume markets, and again, where that freight is going. We're seeing it cross country experience, a downward momentum, and that's freight going over to the West Coast or even down to the Southeast. That mileage gets captured in the cross country. Okay. Freight staying within the Midwest is moving pretty easily still. There's just a lack of volume there for those, larger carriers. When it comes to freight moving down to the South and Southeast, that is where rates are continuing to push upward. I think we're going to continue to see this kind of flat line with a slim drop over the next 2 weeks, but we will experience more momentum to downward pressure on rates in the Midwest in the second half of April for sure.
Okay. Now, the West Coast continues to see tightening in almost all markets, especially those in Nevada and California. Mid-hauls are seeing a near 3% increase over a 7-day delta. We know this is another big region to watch, as we've mentioned over the past, I would say 2 weeks at this point now, or maybe longer. But what are the big call-outs this week?
Yeah, I think we are going to continue to be talking about the West Coast more than probably anywhere other than maybe the Southeast.
Yeah.
Because we went so long with any upward momentum. The weather just didn't impact the West Coast. Now we're starting to see some impacts. And it's in some of the high-volume markets in Southern California, parts of, Nevada, Arizona, even New Mexico. Like, a lot of that capacity is being shifted to the south, right? But at the same time, there is more volume coming out of the West Coast right now. Rates out of the Pacific Northwest are going to continue their downward trend, although it's not very volume driving markets up there. But we got to keep an eye here because this is where rates can shift the most, the fastest, the momentum. Since most freight leaving the West Coast are going to be on longer lengths of haul, it makes a larger impact to the average rate. But it's definitely something to keep an eye on because generally speaking, the West Coast plays as a domino effect across other markets as it draws in capacity on longer lengths of haul, which removes capacity out of the East Coast for a longer period of time. That causes that unbalance of capacity for short periods of time.
Yeah. The West Coast is one to watch, but and you've given us sprinkles of what to expect throughout the month. So before we go, it's time to break out that crystal ball once again for the top of the month April predictions. Now we've got 30 days to see some potentially big changes. So what do you think we should be expecting this month?
Well, it's interesting because at a national level, I don't think we're going to see such a noticeable change.
Okay.
Like I mentioned earlier, the month of April generally speaks to a softer freight market, and that's why I think we're going to end up seeing about a 1.5% decrease in the average rate across the country.
Okay.
But when you go to regional outlooks, it's very different, where we're going to see a lot of movement. In particular, the Midwest and Northeast is going to see a lot of downward pressure that picks up momentum in the second half of the month. And those regions, freight originating out of those regions, are going to probably experience up to close to a 4% decrease from where they are today.
Wow.
On the flip side, the average rates leaving the region southeast and west are probably going to see about a 2% increase. Not as much of an increase as what we're seeing a decrease in the northeast and midwest, but that's why on average we're going to see the national level experience a 1.5% decrease. When it comes to tender rejections, I think we're going to be sitting flat for quite a while until we see some real upward momentum. We're going to be, it's kind of balancing on anywhere from 3.25 to 3.75% rejections.
Okay.
Again, I don't think we're going to be talking too much about some volatility at a national level through the month of April, but the month of May definitely will bring different surprises because you have DOT week and you have more seasonality peek through with produce.
Lots to expect this month, and I think, like you mentioned, we'll sort of watch the next week or so pass by pretty quietly, and then once we head into the second half of the month, I think things will shift over, like you mentioned. That said, we've got a lot to look out for, but of course, we will see where we net out as we progress through the month. Also, happy Q2 to everyone out there with the start of a brand new quarter. With that, we'll see you next week with an all-new episode of the Transfix Take podcast. And until then, if you are in one of the rainy regions, stay dry and, of course, drive safely.